Today in this video, I present to you Taking the Initiative with Active Peace Play, where Chess Assassin brings fire to the chessboard. And as I have stated before, positional value outweighs monetary value. Don't just play chess, play like a king. In this game, both players take a different approach. They start the game off with symmetry. After white advances the pawn to c4, black accepts in order to create an imbalance in the pawn structure. In the opening phase of the game, pawns open up the board for the minor pieces to come out. Then the battle of the minor pieces begin. Which side has the superior minor piece? After recapturing the pawn on c4, where will white place the bishop? On b3, c2, or d3? With the rook already on d1, white takes control of the d file. And notice the pawn structure for both sides, a symmetrical pawn structure. After a6, white redeploys the bishop to d3 on the b1 to h7 diagonal. Knight to e4 does not win a piece for black. If the rook captures the bishop, then knight captures bishop on c5. While both of white's bishops are centralized, black has no weaknesses. However, there is a dilemma. The queen's bishop on c8 is stuck behind the pawns. So what we're going to do is take some moves back and see if there's something else that black can do. After pawn to a6, for example, pawn to a4, and then pawn to e6. Is this the move that black should play? Well, it's playable. But what about knight c6? Knight c6 with the idea of advancing the pawn to e5. For example, e4 and pawn to e5. And this option leaves black's light square bishop open on the c8 to h3 diagonal. Pay close attention to this line. This line's continuation, then play gets very sharp. The knight on g4 threatens a fork on f2. So what does the knight do? The knight hops to d5 with a counter threat. This is the tactician's style of play. And here the move is bishop to c5 to cover the knight on f2. Knight takes c7 check. And after king f8, knight captures a8 and knight captures h1. All right, let's take the moves back and go back to the game's continuation. Black chooses e6. Choosing solidarity, the bishop will be developed to e7 and the king will castle. King safety first. And then we'll continue with pawn to c5 and knight to c6. And this move order is about restraining white's pieces. In this position, typical play can continue with queen to c7, placing the queen on the dark square diagonal, eyeing the e5 square. Is there a more aggressive option here? Instead of queen c7, pawn captures pawn on d4, and after the recapture, the knight hops to the d5 square. So what is the result of this active play? More piece trades take place, and after the smoke clears, the follow-up is bishop e6, and white is left with an isolated pawn on d4. And after black plays the bishop to f6, the queen will have to move, and the pawn on d4 will become a permanent target for black, with other possibilities such as queen d8 to b6, with pressure on the d4 pawn. Not only the d pawn, but also the b pawn on b2 becomes a target after queen b6. Okay, let's take the moves back and go back to the game's continuation. So the move played here is queen to c7, and instead of capturing the pawn on d4, queen c7. However, white takes the opportunity to buy time, pawn to d5, and after these trades, white's bishop momentarily dominates the light squares. Bishop to f6 and rook to a3 was played in the game. In place of the rook lift, did white have a more aggressive rook option? A3, play bishop to d2, sacrificing the pawn on b2. And what does this do for white? Well, bishop captures b2, rook b1, and after the bishop retreat, white in turn gets to exploit black's pawn on the c5 square, which is temporarily undefended. Queen c4. So not only does white get to apply pressure to the pawn, but the bishop on d5 threatens to capture the knight on c6. And b6 is not playable here. That will leave the knight on c6 free. So white's logic here is initiative over material. You sacrifice for the initiative. Now black has two weak pawns on the c file, and they're doubled. Sooner or later, one of the pawns are going to fall. If it's not the c pawn on c5, then the pawn on c6 will fall eventually. And the player of the defending side will have to decide how to get compensation for his double pawns on the c file. Initiative over material. Okay, let's take the moves back, and we're going to go to the game's continuation. A rook lift to a3. Two options, rook b8 or rook on f to d8. If rook b8, that indicates that black wants to advance the b pawn. But rook on f to d8 sets up an x-ray. And white's reply is pawn to h3 in order to create luft for the king to step out. Black does the same thing by playing the pawn to h6. Rook on f to d8 is more active. It x-rays the rook on d1. And the continuation for black is knight to b4. And this attacks the bishop on d5. Bishop c4 is played to reserve the bishop, keeping pressure on black's f7 pawn. So in order to counter this, bishop e6 challenges the bishop on c4. And this connects both rooks on A8 and D8. And then bishop D2 allows the B2 pawn to be captured. But this is tactical because rook B3 attacks the bishop, and after the retreat, white regains the pawn on B4. Initiative over material. Sacrifice for the initiative. Now returning to the game's continuation after rook B8. Every move choice is not a mistake. Neither is every move an inaccuracy. However, it becomes a style of choice. Black's style of play is defensive. This approach allows white to overplay or overextend the position. King safety before taking action in the center. And after all the demands of the position are met, then that's when black goes in for the kill. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to hit that like button, share, and subscribe. Stay tuned.